I'm Jeremy Ratt. I'm half Indigenous and half white. Pieces is an all-new CBC British Columbia original podcast. This is a story of being stuck between two worlds, and not really fitting in with either of them.
So because I don't have darker skin or long brown hair, that therefore I was not Indigenous.
You don't have to be a residential school survivor yourself to be traumatized by residential school.
Pieces. Listen to it now, wherever you get your podcasts.
This is a CBC podcast.
Danse, Anin, Boujou. Hello and welcome. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. I want to tell you about a friend, a storyteller, and a matriarch, Stalo writer Lee Maracle. I met Lee back in 2017 at a writers' festival in Kingston, Ontario. Actually, we met on the train traveling there from Toronto. It was my first time taking the train, and I was clearly lost and a bit terrified. But then Lee showed up. Her big smile flashed through the crowd, her signature backpack on. She quickly led the way. She offered me the seat next to her, and we made each other comfortable, passing stories back and forth. When we got to the hotel, we checked in and had dinner in the restaurant together. For 2 hours, we shared food, belly-aching laughter, and anti-wisdom, just as our ancestors did for generations. She said things like, as Indigenous women, we carry the heart of our nations. And my world shifted. The next year, Lee invited me to another writers' festival, this one in Orillia, Ontario. I say invited, but really, she summoned me. That was Lee. If she wanted you to be somewhere, you showed up. This time, it was a road trip with Tanya Talaga, Anishinaabe journalist, best-selling author, and truth teller. Lee offered me her couch to sleep on before we would head out the next morning. I couldn't believe it. I was going to sleep on Lee Maracle's couch. Then I saw Lee Maracle's couch. It was a small sofa that sat between the stairs and a wooden shelf, full of mismatched dishes, glasses, and cups. Make yourself at home, she said, and shuffled off into her small kitchen to pour us some drinks. We sat on her back porch talking late into the night. She shared knowledge about her garden, her love of quilting, and her plans to go home to the West Coast someday. Afterwards, I lay on that couch, covered in a patchwork quilt handmade by Lee. Her story quilt hanging in my memory, my head bumping up against the shelf, my feet bent up against the wall. It was lumpy, and I could hear the furnace go on and off all night. It was by far the worst sleep I ever had. But as I lay there in the dark, I smiled. Because I was on Lee Maracle's couch. Make yourself at home, she said. And my world shifted again. There are more festivals, more dinners, and deep conversations on Lee's porch. Always she offered all that she had. Her food, her home, her joy, her truth. Even if it was a hard truth. Or a hard couch, for that matter. Always with a smile and that unforgettable laugh. Of course, I knew Lee's work before we met. Her book, I Am Woman, changed how I felt about being an Indigenous woman. After I read it, I claimed the word feminist for the first time. I felt powerful, fierce. Her poetry book, Bent Box, spoke truth to power until it was truth and power. It was my truth and power. I felt fearless, unapologetic. Her books include my conversations with Canadians, Bobby Lee, Indian Rebel, Raven Song, Celia's Song. The list of her work is long and beautiful. I looked forward to reading more of her words in the years to come. On November 11th, Lee Maracle passed away. She was 71 years old on this earth. and she left many mourning hearts. But we celebrate her knowing that Lee has gone home, that now she is one of our ancestors, watching over us, guiding us. And my world shifts once more. Today, Unreserved honors Lee Maracle. Métis matriarch Maria Campbell remembers raising resistance with Lee in the 1970s. Anishinaabe novelist Waubgeshig Rice and Cree author Tracy Lindberg talk about the trail she broke for other writers. And Gregory Scofield gifts her a poem for her journey home. But we begin with Lee. After the lumpy couch incident in 2018, I invited Lee to a conversation on Unreserved. Hello, Lee. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
We talked about her rise in the Can-Lit community, the push to keep her out, and the future of Indigenous story. But like all conversations with Lee, there just wasn't enough room or time to air the whole interview. And so we offer it here in its entirety today. I first asked Lee about when she appeared on the literary scene in the early 1970s. She was living in Vancouver back then, following a path freshly blazed by Maria Campbell, author of Half-Breed. When you did your first book, Bobby Lee, was published in 1975, what was the native lit scene like then?
There was just Maria Campbell all alone out in the world with her book. So I got lucky of having someone that came ahead of me whose work was being promoted. But the other experience I had at the time was that publishers were telling me they don't publish Indians, that's what they called us then, because Indians can't read or write. But I went downtown where, Main and Hastings, where all our people hang out, and I had a friend help me, and we actually did a survey of how many people could read and write that were downtown. 2/3 could not. We were horrified. But we had been to public school, and all those people that couldn't read or write were residential school survivors. They did not teach reading and writing in the BC residential schools. So we decided to run projects teaching Indigenous people to read and write. We engaged the help of white people all over the place, sent people all over the province. I think Ronnie Ignace actually was one of the guys that learned to read and write at 21, and now he's put out a book and got a PhD. I mean, it was an amazing time. So that's part of the difficulty, is the business of reading and writing itself. And of course, there's no libraries anywhere near Reserve, so I only had a dictionary at home, an unabridged Noah Webster dictionary. So, there was our stories and their dictionary. And then our language kind of was like an interruption, I had such a struggle with our language. But Maria did also, because she speaks Cree and Métis, as well as English, So it's difficult to transmogrify into a whole nother language that is a whole different way of presenting things. And to try and figure out how to write with that, without any examples to go on, I really saw Maria's book as an oral storytelling, and Bobby Lee for sure was. It was a course, and it was told orally, and then I transcribed it, and someone else edited it, and then they published it. So the whole thing was done orally. Then I went through 13 dry years because I actually didn't know how to write yet. Like, what am I going to, I just get a mic,
But you were busy. So you were still busy. You were teaching other Indigenous people how to read when they said, well, we don't do this. Well, now we have Indigenous people that can read and write. So after you entered the scene, as it were, what did you expect would happen?
I didn't have a clue. In my conversations with Canadians, I talk about that first reading, and the guy says, the publisher says, you got to do a tour. And I said, well, what's that all about? Because, I'm not a musician. He says, you got to read from your work. And I said, do you really think people who can't read are going to buy a book just because I read it to them? And he says, no, they can read. Well, why don't they just buy the damn book and read it themselves? You know, he says, you really don't know what this is about, do you? And I said, apparently not. But they sent me all down the West Coast and all the way across Canada and into, I think, New York. I ended up in New York. And I'm telling you, you know, Rosanna, my name was Lee, so everybody was expecting a guy. And it was the 60s, so in 70s, you know, so all these Panthers show up and where's the guy? You know, they were not happy campers. But after, you know, chatting for a while and hearing the book and so on and talking about writing, they actually started thinking about it. Not just, you know, being oral speakers, but they're oral people too. African Americans are still very oral people. A lot of them are sub-Saharan African, which has got a strong oral tradition, just like we do. Mm-hmm. And so we talked about that. And they said to me, I remember this guy saying to me, I never did think about African culture before. Mm-hmm. I mean, we've been here 300 years. We think it's all lost. But you're right, we're still oral.
Yeah.
Storytelling is a big part of their life and way of being. And so a lot of them started thinking that maybe they should, you know, go to storytelling as well. So I was really happy about that. But I also ran into a lot of Native people who were just thrilled to see, first of all, that I was actually brown. Someone said that to me. Oh, you're not one of these white Indians. They were so happy about that. But also that I was coming from story from my own place, you know, that I had the courage to come from story from my own place. Also, they really liked that I was a speaker in a traditional style orator from my community. That meant so much to people because I think we were afraid to pick our bundles up in the 70s. Yeah. We'd just come out of residential school and boarding school, and we were afraid of our own cultures.
Yeah, yeah.
Afraid of our own languages, afraid of our own stories. And so that became really important. I think it was like a revolution, you know, myself and Maria out there clamoring about the world.
My name is Black Thunderbird Woman. I never say that very often, but I wanted to say that today. My English name is Maria Campbell, and I'm from Gabriel's Crossing, Métis. I met Lee, I think, about 1974 or the latter part of 73 in Vancouver. And she was very young, I remember, because I think she's about 10 years younger than I am, or 12 years or something. Yeah. But I just remember how good it was to see her out there. Shortly after Half Breed was published, Lee published Bobby Lee. So there was two of us, women anyway, for sure, that were out there. And we were very popular, both of us. We were invited to communities all over. I remember being invited along with Jeanette Armstrong, and I met her in a workshop, which is the second, when I met Lee the second time, it was in a workshop. You know, we used writing workshops really to do organizing, and everybody would come because it was a writing and poetry workshop, and then we would talk about change through literature and poetry and theater, and how important those were to use in our communities. So it was exciting times. And what I remember about Lee was she was so fearless. She was the generation after me. My generation were not as fearless as she was, because we had grown up having to do things always, like we say in Cree, on the Kimuch, meaning that we always had to be really careful how we did things. And she was so articulate. Again, my generation, we were not as articulate. I wasn't as articulate as that for sure anyway. I always admired her and Jeanette because they were able to really use the English language and articulate for all of us the things that many of us couldn't, didn't know how to say. And I also came from the generation where we were so, policies were so bad, people couldn't do ceremonies even. And to meet a younger, two younger women like her and Jeanette was quite powerful because we were able to have these conversations among ourselves. And it was like, well, why can't we do it? Well, of course we can. So that it wasn't just inspiring, it was invigorating. During those times, we talked a lot about movement and change. And so for me, I think of movement in my language, waskawiwin, where after sitting up all night drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes with the two of them, I would feel all of this change and movement in me. That's what's waskawian, movement was happening all over. I couldn't still my brain. I was thinking all the time. And it was always just a big rush to be with the two of them. When people lift community, when you lift up community, you leave something behind that's always going to be there and it's always going to move forward. In our language, that's what waskawiwin means, that movement. Once something moves, starts to move, you can't stop it. We didn't visit very often, but whenever we were together, we picked up where we left off. Lee and I have sat up at night and had big, long, really hard, discussions, and I'm going to really miss that. And it certainly makes me think that I have to get busy and get the rest of my work done. It's like, come on there, ladies, we don't have a whole lot of time left.
And that was Métis writer and knowledge keeper Maria Campbell. She was remembering her friend and contemporary Lee Maracle. You're listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Today we are honoring the celebrated Stalo writer Lee Maracle. She passed away earlier this month. On the show today, you'll hear an extended conversation I had with her in 2018, some never broadcast before. One of the first things you learn about Lee is that she was a force to be reckoned with. I learned that on our road trip to Aurelia. After reading from our books, there was an audience Q&A. An elderly lady with a British accent stood up and said she didn't feel she had anything to do with reconciliation, and asserted that she felt attacked. Well, Lee threw her hands up and said, well, if that's the case, then what the hell am I doing here? And she walked to her seat and sat down, much to the shock of me and Tanya Talaga, who then had to deal with this question. And what happens when an unstoppable force meets an unmovable object? Well, something's got to give. There you were, a brown Indian, to use your words, telling your story, honoring your oral traditions, and bringing in, so the public obviously were like, wow, this is great. What about the Canlit scene? How did the Canlit scene react to you and your work, or did they?
Actually, they didn't want to put me on the podium at all. I asked to be a part of the Vancouver Writers' Festival for launching I Am Woman. I'd launched it in Montreal to huge success. And they said no. So I went there and I got up on stage and grabbed the mic. And I did a reading.
You just walked up there and grabbed the mic.
That's what I did. I said, right now you're in my village. This is my original village. This village is Sanok. And I'm going to read here. It was Catalano's village.
What did they do?
They were horrified, but they didn't do anything. Someone reviewed my conversations with Canadians, and she said, this guy yelled at Lee. in the first chapter, I couldn't believe that anyone ever yelled at Lee. Have you heard her speak? But I was using the big house voice. Our longhouse voice is really huge, eh? Mm-hmm. And this is blah, 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 you know, and it goes like a machine gun. The sound of it is huge. And so people just sat quietly. And then I did this really amazing reading of I Am Woman. And people were very moved. And I had books on me because they had no books of mine for sale, not even Bobby Lee. It was still in print too, but I had books on me and people came up to my table and bought books. So after that, the Vancouver Writers Festival invited me many times over to present. Every time I had a new book, actually, they invited me to present at the Writers Festival.
Because they knew you were going to show up anyway, or?
Yeah, exactly, because I was going to get up on the stage. And then other writers' festivals heard about me, and there was quite a lot of discussion about my work, especially after the feminist book tour, when I asked people to stop writing our stories and give us room to write our own. So that was in '88, so there was a lot of discussion about that. Some people called me a fascist. I mean, the literary people were really pissed. They still are, and that's why they're doing that appropriation award. Eh? They're still mad that we don't want them to write our stories. They do not want to give us room.
Tell me more about that. Why did you want to do that? Why did you stand up in such a public way and say, leave our stories alone, those are ours?
Because first of all, they were doing the wrong thing with them. I'm not allowed to get up and write my story down. That's not how we work with story. It's called working with story, and all my life growing up, I worked with story. Your grandfather or your grandmother tells you a story, and you tell it back different but the same. That is, you make up a new story based on that story. Mm-hmm. So that's how we develop new stories. We're still creating oral tradition by the way we work with story. Mm-hmm. I know my cousin just did this magnificent piece of work with a theater company. They got him to do some of the writing for their latest show this last summer. And he's such a beautiful poet. The translations are so perfect. It's so extraordinary. So it encouraged people like him. He's a little bit younger than me, but my writing encouraged him to go after the language after coming out of residential school, and then go after the poetry of the language and start to write poetry. And I think it just made all the difference in the new wave of writers. They gained so much permission from the way that I wrote and all the battles that I fought. And I have to tell you, Rosanna, I don't give up till I win.
That's why we love you, Lee. That's why we love you.
We're also very competitive compared to Anishinaabe's and Crees.
The Crees are a little more polite than
yeah, they're way more polite. We walk around with a club in one hand and a rope in the other.
That's Lee Maracle, joking, or not joking, about the ferocity of her people. But making room for others was no joke to Lee. Lee left an indelible impression on those she met. Métis poet Gregory Scofield recalls meeting her when he was 16 years old. Still young and finding his words then, Gregory now gifts her with the poetry she always encouraged in him.
On the day that I heard that Lee had made her journey home, I was speechless. I mean, this, I think came as a big shock for a lot of us. And then I thought, well, if I'm going to be adding anything to the condolences and things that are floating around social media, the best way that I can honor Lee on her journey is to give her a poem. And so this is a poem. It is called Ghost Dance. Then I will paint my shirt with earth and sky, crows and magpies. When the sun goes into shadow, I will lay myself down, and in my breath I will see the heavens. I will see you, and I will dance dance my face dappled in stars, and on my neck will hang your songs, owl feathers swift, swift in their flight, calling me to fall down, to humble my bones in the lilt of your singing. Then you will paint me in red ochre, my shirt, this skin, no longer torn and tattered, and I will rise. I will dance this passage of time. I will dance the moon. I will dance the bullets of fear. I will dance the bullets of sorrow. I will take flight, a skybird, drawn in pigments of blue and yellow. Then I will be new, holy in the light of your face.
You're listening to Unreserved. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Today, a special tribute to Stalo storyteller Lee Maracle. Still to come, Waubgeshig Rice, author of Moon of the Crusted Snow, shares how reading Bobby Lee shaped his own journey. That's later on Unreserved. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Let's get...
Oh boy. Canada. Well, doesn't it derive from Agunyaga word?
Means village.
As Indigenous people, we are used to our stories getting a little twisted. So listen up as we set the record straight. I'm Ganyetio. Please join me as we hear from dozens of Indigenous people. Together, we will decolonize our words and our minds on the Telling Our Twisted Histories podcast. You can find episodes on the CBC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Back to our conversation with Lee. It seemed that the problem with Lee Maracle was that Lee had a problem with Canada, something she tackled with her usual directness in her book of essays, My Conversations with Canadians. Throughout the book, she asked the country very direct questions that had been simmering inside her for decades. So in that time when you're not being invited to events and gatherings, and meanwhile you're kicking down doors, why do you think that they didn't want to invite you to the podium? What was going on there?
Well, first of all, this is our country, and then they have to face that. And then there's tremendous guilt because they've robbed us not just of our land, but our minds. The people that came here, Rosanna, didn't even wash, so they didn't know about sanitation. That was our first gift of knowledge to them. They died during childbirth, so that was our second gift, was midwifery. We taught their women how to deliver babies. And it wasn't until 1880 that the male doctors actually washed their hands. So, it took the male white men a lot longer to learn about sanitation. But the female midwives learned about our medicines and so on and so forth. And they use it, and they sold it to the Chinese, and white people call it Chinese medicine. But in China, they call it Anishinaabe medicine. Because that's where they got it. Except for ginseng. But even ginseng actually came from here. It had died out in China for 1,000 years, but they brought it here 2,500 on the west coast. And so it went all over the continent, all over the island. So all of these things nobody knows about, but it's in our oral storytelling tradition. And I thought, well, I guess it would be easy for the Chinese to come here because they had ships. They had actually the best ships 2,500 years ago. So they'd come here and they'd, leave behind ginseng. And none of us changed the name of it because we're very, very respectful. White people changed the names of everything that they took from us. But then they were selling our medicine back to the Chinese in huge amounts and for a lot of money. They made a lot of money off us. So that's part of the appropriation. Everything got appropriated, even our intellectual property. And they didn't have to credit us because it was oral. So that's why we struggled so hard to get them to just stop robbing us. And then they have to face that. And they don't want to, or they didn't at the time. It was such a Even the so-called radical leftists were, well, you're just workers, No, this is our country. That's the place we got to start. That's where we start. And even today, people say, well, we got to find a way to fit your science into ours. And Susan Blight, who works here, says, no, yours fits into ours. You have to fit into our way, not the other way around. This is our country. So that's all part of it, that they don't want to face that. They don't want to look at that. They don't want to face that they did nothing while we were being killed. Mm-hmm. They can watch us die. And I put it in Raven's Song, in a novel. Just that one little line, these people can watch us die. And it was such a shock. That one book, I tell you, it's still going because it's still relevant. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The missing and murdered women is still there. You're still killing us.
And they're still watching.
They're still watching and doing nothing.
So how have you seen it change over the years, or has it changed? Is it changing?
Well, I think there's a lot more women that are active helping us. We have a lot more support than we had in my day. Dion Brand used to laugh, 6 poets and their 6 friends, 6 people of color and their 6 friends. That was the audiences in the back in the 80s and 70s. Like, not a lot of people came out to hear us. Yeah. And it wasn't just Indigenous people, but women of color generally and men of color. It was very difficult to get an audience. But now that's changed. The audience is also lots of people of color, which I'm really happy about, because the early audiences I had to face were, all white and really didn't know anything about us. They'd been here 400 years and they knew nothing. Shame on Canada, really shame on them.
Hello, I'm Tracy Lindberg. I'm a citizen of the Kelly Lake Cree, a Siniwache Nihao. I'm a law professor and a writer, and I am a person who loves and loved Lee Maracle, and who, within a law course, required her book, I Am Woman, as a mandatory reading and text. The law students just loved it. The students who took the book and took the course, took the book is probably more accurate, still talk about it to this day. When I had Birdie out it had been out for perhaps 6 months. I think Lee represented the book at some Kitchener Reads or something like that. And she had won with the book, and she had done all the argument that were fundamental to it and brought it forward. The day that I saw her after she won, I thanked her for it. And she said privately to me, you have a problem with your narrative. And took me aside and just sort of skillfully sliced and diced. And I was so mad. But not necessarily at Lee. I was so mad that I think that I hadn't been humble, and that her constant reminder was that you need to be humble. You need to be acting and writing with humility, because this stuff goes into people's homes, and that's really important. So we had this moment, and I never considered it a fight or a falling out or anything like that. I just considered it a place where I was embarrassed. And that's okay. Embarrassment is okay as well. But it sat with me, and I thought about it over the years. And then I saw her maybe 4 years after that. And she came up to me and said, I have to tell you about the problem with the narrative in Birdie. And I said to her, Lee, you already told me, and I now actually agree with you. But because she was miles ahead, and it took time to get there, and it took time for me to learn to be humble, she was still willing to teach. Even if she forgot in between, she knew that it was important enough for me to know that ethic of brutal honesty, I think, to me, is the epitome of who she was. And when people say brutal, let's switch it to fierce. She was fiercely loyal. If she had taken somebody in under her wing and she had mentored them along the way, she was fiercely loyal to them and followed them and propped them up all through their careers. She was fiercely intelligent, but in that ferocity, she was able to generate meaningful dialogues in places where people were just tiptoeing around it. So I often, when I think of Lee, I think of her as fierce. People might say angry or difficult to deal with, or the things that people say about people who are brilliant and working ahead of the curve. But she was inclusive, she was kind, she was generous, but she was also somebody who was critically kind and kindly critical and fiercely critical. And for all of those things, we suffer a huge loss, because I don't know that there's anybody right now who steps in and is willing to walk on the landmines every time. Lee never had to be popular. She never had to be the one book you picked up off the shelf. You should. And she would let you know that you should. But she was just so open to the possibility that you could learn from different places that I think the revolution started at her kitchen table, and she brought it out to other places, other rooms that were formal and less formal than that.
Tracy Lindberg is the author of Birdie. You're listening to Unreserved. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Today, a special tribute to Stalo storyteller Lee Maracle. Back to our conversation from 2018. And who do you think has led this change in the lit scene, where we're finally sort of starting to get on the stages and having our pages read and being invited? Who has led this change?
Well, I'm pretty sure that I was one of the ones that got it, because from Bobby Lee to 88 I Am Woman, there wasn't any publishing going on, but I was out there on the stump all the time talking about it and talking with literary people and arguing with people and really battling with folks. And then I got very sick and took a hiatus. But in 88, we started again. A bunch of women went to the International Feminist Book Fair, and they featured us. Those gals featured us. There was myself and 9 other Indigenous women, including Harjo and Jeanette and just everybody that was writing anything. There were 400 people in that room, and its capacity was 3. And they kept telling people, 100 of you have to leave. There's too many. They stayed there. So then they put horns outside, and, I think 700 people listened to us do readings at that feminist book fair.
Yeah.
And my book, I Am Woman, sold more than all the rest of the books at the book fair.
Wow.
I sold 3,000 copies of I Am Woman at that book fair. Jeanette also sold, I think, 2,000. I mean, whatever people brought with them that were Indigenous, they sold. Indigenous people really kicked ass at that conference. So I think that I was in the forefront of all this. I was pretty fearless about it, and I was pretty determined, and it was pretty clear that it was about colonization and decolonization, and nobody was even saying those words outside of me until the 80s. So I know I was in the forefront of all of it because of that, just that. Other people might, talk about the unfairness and our suffering and, that kind of non-agency type way of presenting issues, where white people feel sorry for you. But I was not like that. I was never cut of that cloth. I hung out with Katsalanuk when I was 4 and 5 years old, and he was very clear with me. This is our country. This is our country, and you make them fit into your way of life. You make them behave like us. We were unsuccessful, but it's not like we didn't try. It's all about colonization and decolonization. And he would say things like that to me when I was 6 or 7 years old. And I'd say, okay, so excited to go along with this, not realizing how difficult this would be, this program of his.
For sure.
But that's the family I came from. And so it was really different for me. That's the difficulty of some of our folks. They were writing, but they weren't from the community, and they weren't, they didn't have close ties to their communities. So that becomes a difficulty too. So we had to deal with that as well, and talk about how we're going to walk these people home, because so many were either not raised in the community or had been to residential school and didn't know anything about themselves. We were in a tragic state. And I didn't want to say we were in a tragic state because that doesn't use the natural agency of even the most tragic person. You know what I mean? I always wanted to say, all we got to do is give a good push. Hi, look, big wave, we're coming. Tell them to watch out.
Bonjour, Waubgeshig Rice, Makwad Nodem, Wasaksing Tonjaba, Swakamakin Deda. Hi, my name is Waubgeshig Rice. I'm an Anishinaabe and Canadian from Wasaksing First Nation. I am an author and a journalist and a husband and dad of 2 little boys. I first encountered Lee's work when I was a teenager. As I was in high school back in the 1990s, I wasn't really exposed at all to Indigenous authors or their work through the provincial curriculum in Ontario. We were basically just reading the work of old white dudes, right? But I had this aunt who was one of my original teachers at our school on the reserve in Wasaksing. And for my birthday and for Christmas, she gave me books by Indigenous authors. And that included the work of Lee Maracle. I read Bobby Lee, I think, when I was in my late teens. And being exposed to those kinds of stories back then as a teenager in the 1990s was totally mind-blowing. And seeing how someone like Lee could so passionately and profoundly convey her experiences and the stories of her people in the written word just opened my eyes to all the possibilities for me. When I was 32, my first collection of short stories was published called Midnight Sweat Lodge. And First Nations House at University of Toronto offered to do a book launch for me. And they offered Lee Maracle to come in and read alongside with me. And it was just, how is this happening? How is this possible? You know, teenage me would have never imagined that. And she was listening to my work. She was, you know, applauding. She was actively engaged with what I had to share there. And we talked after, and she was just very supportive, you know, very encouraging. And that really, I guess, began, you know, sort of like an auntie influence in my life, a literary auntie, right? And she was there every step of my literary journey. When I was writing my first novel, Legacy, there were some things I was really unsure of because that story is about a family, an Anishinaabe family overcoming tragedy and dealing with the fallout of trauma over the rest of their lives, right? And it was inspired and influenced by a lot of the things I encountered growing up in an Anishinaabe community. And, you know, some details were drawn from some of the things that my family endured as well. And I always wanted to be really careful and considerate of some of those things. And I was in consultation with, you know, my family members too, as I was writing it. But I always had this ending in mind for it that I wasn't really sure of. And I asked her once, we were at an event in Toronto, and I said, you know, Lee, I'm writing this story and this ending came to me and I really don't like it. I really don't like it. And I'm unsure about ending the story that way. And she said, well, you know, if that's how the story came to you, you have to honor it. You have to see it through. You are a conduit, and wherever this story came from, whoever gifted it to you, you have to honor them as well. So I stuck with it. And she said also, in a few years' time, if you're not satisfied with it or it doesn't sit well with you, just change it. Just do a revised version, you know, and I think in that sense, her lesson was that we have these truths that we share, but our storytelling methods are very fluid and we can be very flexible with them. Like, just keep the core elements there. But if there's some little details you want to change for the sake of the story itself, you can do that. That's what our people have done for thousands and thousands of years. For me, at this point of my life and career, it's incumbent upon me to continue to mentor aspiring storytellers and writers, because that's what Lee did for me. It's what she did for probably like 1,000 people out there, you know? So it's up to me to take people in, to listen to them, to read their work, to provide whatever guidance I can, and to remind them that I'm doing this because Lee Maracle did this for me, and then they will do it for the generations that come afterwards.
Waubgeshig Rice, author of Moon of the Crusted Snow. He's one of many Indigenous writers whose work and lives have been shaped by Lee Maracle. and she thought the world of them.
I'm just so proud of these kids. It's a bigger wave. It's like a mini tsunami. The first wave was like, a little blip in the ocean, but now there's a lot of young writers. Also, they've been able to study the older writers, and they've been able to read older writers. So they have this sensibility that's really, really powerful, and they're well read. They're already literary, when they start. So that's awesome. That's awesome. My niece just came out with a great little book called Heartberries, and it's kicking ass all over the U.S. and Canada. Lots of poetry in it. It's Stalo. I mean, the English is Stalo. Oh, so beautiful. And I grew up with her mom, and we were really close friends. So my kids grew up together. Our kids all grew up together. And we were always writing and playing poetry games and playing story games and all this kind of stuff. But we weren't the only ones. There were several other women in that community that were writers too. But none of them thought they were good enough to get published. And so when the second wave came along, they felt like they had a right to be published. Whereas my contemporaries didn't want to fight with white people about getting published. It was so, it was a debilitating time when we just didn't have a lot of courage, and some of us had too much hurt in our lives to be brave enough to go out there and have those people throw rocks at us, kind of. Because that's kind of what it was like. My first book tour, I lost my hair. I went bald because it was so terrifying.
I asked Lee what book by an Indigenous author everyone in Canada should read, and she chose two: The Marrow Thieves by Cherie Demeline and The Break by Catherine Vermette. And why did you like those books? Why did you love them?
Well, The Marrow Thieves, there's something beautiful about the concept, the idea that our dreams are located in our marrow. And there's a realization by Cherie that these people have lost the ability to dream, which is why they can't connect with us right now. Like this is also contemporary. They are not a people of dreamers the way we are. And so the dream world isn't the same size as their living world. The dream world is quite small in their society. So I think it's a powerful text that way, in getting people to switch the way they're looking at themselves and really struggle with their own being. But also it's about genocide. Yeah, it's just plain up and plain and simple, because these people are trying to kill them all because they're jealous that they still can dream.
Yeah.
And that's basically what happened. What we had here was like Eden, and they tried to kill us all for it. So that's one of them. But the other book is, there's this passage in there that I think the book is worth it for that one passage. But it's that woman that's up in the sky world talking to her daughter down below. I'm waiting for you. I will always wait for you. And she's assuring her in her struggles with life. And this girl's really battling. And the women in that book are so amazing all the way through. And of course the writing is so beautiful. It's almost poetry all the way through. It's so poetic. It's so engaging. But anyway, that one passage, I really love it because it's our worldview. We don't see a difference between the world of the dead and the world of the living. So you get the feeling from that passage, that chapter, that the dead miss us too. We don't just miss them, but they're missing us, and they're always watching us. And my mother used to say that. She'd say, oh, well, Indigenous people don't have, fantasy on the one hand and reality on the other. Our dead are right here. They're listening to us. They're all around us, and they're caretaking us. So that book, The Break, made that feel real for me. Again, like my mother would have. And Katharina is a Métis. My mother was Métis. She would make it feel so real for me. And I love that. I love that when we bring our magical world of the dead together with the world of the living unapologetically. And that's Katharina.
Lee, thank you so much for your wisdom and your time today.
Okay. Bye-bye.
That's Lee Maracle, who reminds us no one is ever really gone. Thank you, Ginaskna Mitten, for the many conversations, support, and love you gifted me, gifted us all over the years. I will hold your words close to my heart, always. I love you, my friend. Travel well. That's it for our time together here on Unreserved. This episode was produced by Aaron Knoll, Kim Kasher, Laura Bone Stubing, and me, Rosanna Deerchild. Special thanks to Justin Yee for finding that archival interview from 2018. We could not have done this show without you. If you want to hear this episode again or share it with friends, you can find it on our website at cbc.ca/unreserved. Download the podcast on the CBC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your favorite cousin, coming at you from Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory. Ginaskna Mitnawi, Egose.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.